The roses were arranged incorrectly, and Eleanor was the only person in the ballroom who knew it. She stood at the far end of the east gallery, a clipboard pressed to her forearm, and a list of 47 tasks spread across 3 sheets of foolscap, and she watched the footmen arrange the centerpieces according to the florist's instructions, rather than the table dimensions, which meant the arrangements for the round tables near the orchestra were 6 inches too tall and would obstruct sightlines across the entire eastern half of the room. No one had told the florist about the round tables. Eleanor had included it in the written brief she sent in October, 3 weeks before the Ashworth Winter Ball was confirmed. The florist had lost the brief, or ignored it, or never opened it. It did not matter which. She set her clipboard down on the nearest sideboard, crossed the room without rushing, and redirected the footman herself. Above her, the chandeliers blazed. 214 candles had been lit by the under-footman in the hour before the guests arrived, and the light fell across the polished floor like something spilled and beautiful, catching the gilt frames and the crystal drops, and the white silk of a dozen gowns already moving through the entrance hall. The guests of the Earl of Ashworth's winter ball arrived in a particular order, which Eleanor had also documented. The county families first, then the titled families from London, then the names that required careful placement, because their feuds with other names required careful placement, and finally, this evening, the name that had arrived last for 3 consecutive years, and was expected to do so again. The Duke of Ravenswood. Eleanor did not look toward the entrance hall when the announcement came. She was correcting a placement card that had been transposed. The Marchioness of Trevelyan, seated beside Mr. Alderton, who had publicly opposed her late husband's estate settlement, and the correction required her full attention because the replacement card needed to be written in the same hand as the original, which was the under-butler's hand, and she had spent 11 years learning to replicate it well enough that no one noticed the substitution. She finished the card, placed it with precision, and only then allowed herself to look up. Frederick Ashworth, the 7th Duke of Ravenswood, stood at the edge of the entrance hall, where it opened into the ballroom, and he looked at almost nothing. That was the word for it. Almost. He looked at the room the way a man looks at a clock to confirm the time, registered, and moved on. He wore a dark coat and no decorations, which was unusual for a ball of this kind, and his cravat was precisely arranged, and his expression communicated neither pleasure nor inconvenience. He had done his research before coming. Eleanor suspected he had done his research before attending anything, but what research had brought him back to Ashworth Hall for the 3rd winter running she could not say. What she could say was that his cravat was slightly crooked on the left side, pulled by a pin that had been placed a 1/4 inch too high. She noticed it the way she noticed the rose arrangements and the placement card, not with satisfaction or criticism, but with the quiet precision of a person whose occupation was accurate observation. She returned to her list. There were 43 tasks remaining. He did look at her once. She was not certain how it happened. She was not watching for it, but at some point during the correction of the 3rd placement card on the east table, she became aware of being observed, and when she looked up, Frederick Ashworth was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not the particular deliberate interest men sometimes showed when they chose to notice a woman. Not dismissal either. It was the expression of someone who had just identified something unexpected in a room they believed they had already fully understood. Eleanor held his gaze for precisely 2 seconds, long enough to acknowledge it, not long enough to invite anything from it, then looked back at her list. There were still 43 tasks to complete, and she had 2 hours to complete them. She went to work. She had come to Ashworth Hall in the 2nd year of her father's illness, which had been the year she turned 21, and understood clearly that the house she had grown up in, a respectable property in Wiltshire, a comfortable living, a library that had taken her father 30 years to build, was in the hands of his cousin Philip, from the moment her father could no longer sign his own name. Philip Crane was not a malicious man, precisely. He was a man who had always assumed that the management of property was a simple matter that capable men handled without difficulty, and that the women in a household existed to perform the ornamental functions that made a house pleasant to be in. He arrived 3 days after Eleanor's father suffered his 2nd episode, looked around the entrance hall with the expression of a man taking inventory, and informed Eleanor that the estate accounts would now be his concern. Eleanor did not argue. She was 21 years old, she had no legal standing in the matter, and she had already spent 2 years managing those accounts herself, while her father's attention narrowed to his medical concerns and his books. She knew exactly what the accounts contained. She knew which creditors were owed what amounts, on what schedule, in what order. She knew that the wool merchant's contract renewed in March and had a penalty clause if renegotiated after the first of the month. She knew that the Southfield drainage needed addressing before spring, or the ground would be unworkable. She wrote all of it down in a document she placed on Philip's desk the morning after he arrived, organized by urgency, with the relevant correspondence attached. Philip looked at it with the particular expression of a man encountering something he did not expect and was not certain he wanted. "You have been managing the accounts," he said. "For 2 years," Eleanor told him. "Your father allowed this." "My father asked me to." There was a long pause. Philip set the document to one side, not aside, not away, but marginally to the left, as though he might return to it. He did not return to it. He hired a steward who had managed a smaller property in Yorkshire, a competent man who understood field management but had never handled a creditor negotiation in his life. By April, the wool merchant's penalty clause had been triggered. By June, 3 creditor accounts were in arrears. By August, Philip was reviewing Eleanor's document with the expression of a man reading a report about his own house fire. She did not say anything about it. She was no longer legally his concern, and she had already by then accepted a position as housekeeper at Ashworth Hall, a role that the Countess of Ashworth's previous housekeeper had vacated suddenly upon her marriage, and which Eleanor had learned of through the solicitor who had handled her father's estate, and who had, in his own undemonstrative way, been watching Eleanor's quality for several years. His name was Mr. Edward Calder, and he was 63 years old and had spent 40 years watching the machinery of English property law grind over the people it was not designed to consider. He had told Eleanor about the Ashworth position in the same tone he used for everything, precise and without warmth, but without condescension either, which was its own form of respect. The Countess requires someone who can manage a household of 38 staff across 2 properties, and who is not afraid of the Earl of Ashworth's opinions about household expenditure, he said, which is to say, someone who can document every decision well enough that his opinions become irrelevant. Eleanor took the position. She was 23. For 8 years she managed Ashworth Hall. She did it without title. Her official role was housekeeper, which was a respectable position and also an entirely invisible one in the social architecture of the county, and without public acknowledgement, and without the salary a male estate manager would have earned for equivalent work, which was a discrepancy she had documented with some precision and filed in her own records rather than Ashworth's. She reorganized the household accounts into a system the Countess could actually read. She renegotiated 3 supplier contracts in the first year alone, recovering £40 in annual margin that had been lost to pricing agreed before her arrival. She managed a drainage repair on the Ashworth North fields that the estate's steward had declared necessary, but impossible given the available budget, by identifying a county improvement scheme that covered 2/3 of the cost, a scheme she had found documented in a 3-year-old county records ledger that had been sitting in the estate library since it was filed. She managed crises, in the ordinary way that a person in her position managed crises, before breakfast and without announcement, the way weather is managed, not by stopping it, but by preparing adequately and continuing through. When the Winter Ball's florist failed for the 2nd year, and Eleanor could not find a replacement on 3 days' notice, she drove to the nearest market town herself, sourced the flowers from 4 separate vendors, and arranged them with the kitchen maids in the 2 hours before the guests arrived. No one knew this had happened. The ball proceeded as planned. Eleanor returned to her office and updated her supplier file. The moment she might have broken, the moment she had come closest, was in the 5th year, when the Earl of Ashworth had suggested to his wife, within Eleanor's hearing, that the housekeeper's efficiency was all very well, but it created a certain impression of independence that was not entirely appropriate for a woman in her position. The Countess had not responded with particular vigor. Eleanor had been standing in the morning room doorway, a household schedule in her hands, and she had heard every word. She went back to her office. She sat down at her desk. She put her hand flat on the account ledger for 3 seconds, feeling the solid weight of the boards. Then she picked up her pen and returned to the quarterly review. She was not going to become less than she was, because someone found her quality inconvenient. She had decided this at 21, standing in front of Philip Crane's desk, and she had not found reason to revise the decision since. She had been, in all that time, occasionally noticed by people whose attention mattered to her. Mr. Calder visited twice a year and reviewed her records with the same quiet precision with which he had introduced her to the position, and once, leaving after a particularly thorough review of the drainage documentation, he had said, "Your father would have read this carefully." It was the most complete acknowledgement she had received in 5 years, and she carried it without sentiment, the way one carries a useful tool. There had been a housemaid in her 2nd year, a young woman named Agnes who had been unexpectedly acute about people and who had watched Eleanor manage a particularly difficult supplier negotiation from the kitchen doorway, and then said, privately, that she had never seen anyone handle a man who believed himself indispensable with quite that degree of precision. Eleanor had laughed, genuinely, which she did not do often, and told Agnes she had had some practice. Agnes had left Ashworth to marry a farmer in Cumberland the following spring. Eleanor had written her a reference that she suspected was more honest than the farmer had expected. She had not been loved by the role. She had built it, year by year, into something worthy of her. What she had not anticipated, in 31 years of life and 8 years of Ashworth Hall, was that the Duke of Ravenswood had sent someone to speak with Mr. Calder in November. Frederick Ashworth had held the Ravenswood dukedom for 6 years, which was the length of time since his father's death, and the length of time, Eleanor understood from the household accounts, since anyone at Ravenswood had implemented a functional management system. The estate was not failing. It was the kind of large aristocratic property that could absorb significant mismanagement for some time, before the structural damage became visible from the outside, like a well-built bridge developing cracks in the stone it hid beneath its parapet. But the accounts were inconsistent, and the staff records were 3 years behind, and the supply contracts had been allowed to roll over on unfavorable terms since a steward departed in 1817 without sufficient replacement. Frederick knew this. He had known it for some time. He had hired an investigator the previous winter, not to investigate a person, but to review the estate's management landscape and provide a report on what a functional solution would require. The investigator had filed his report in September. The report contained 14 observations, of which the most structurally significant was the 13th, that the candidate most likely to be both capable of the required reorganization and willing to accept the specific constraints of the Ravenswood position was the current housekeeper at Ashworth Hall. The investigator had been thorough. He had spoken with Mr. Calder. He had reviewed the Ashworth household accounts for the past 8 years, which were available in annotated form because Eleanor had prepared them that way. He had obtained, through channels Frederick did not entirely follow, copies of 3 supplier contracts Eleanor had renegotiated and a summary of the Northfield drainage project. He had also noted, with what Frederick recognized as professional admiration, that the woman responsible for all of this was paid 3/4 of what a male estate manager in an equivalent role would receive. Frederick had read the report twice. Then he had attended the Ashworth Winter Ball for the 3rd consecutive year, this time with a specific purpose. He did not think about it as a romantic matter. He was 34 years old and had been managing a dukedom in grief and isolation since 28, and the wound from his mother's death, which was the wound beneath everything, which he never discussed, and which his father had managed by becoming progressively less human until he died of it, had left him with a fairly complete understanding of his own emotional architecture. He was not looking for warmth, he was looking for a solution. What he found, standing at the edge of the Ashworth ballroom, watching a woman in a gray dress correct a placement card in the same hand as the under-butlers, was something he had not expected. He had expected competence. He had not expected the quality of her stillness, the way she moved through the room without disturbing it, the way her attention went directly, and without waste, to whatever required it. He watched her redirect the footmen at the centerpiece tables, and then return to her list, and there was something in the efficiency of it that reminded him, unexpectedly, of his mother, not in manner or appearance, but in the underlying quality of a person who regarded their work as a matter of precision rather than performance. He looked at her once more before leaving the ballroom that evening. She was standing at the east table reviewing something on her clipboard. She did not look up, but he had the particular and irrational certainty that she had registered his attention and filed it. He went home and wrote to Mr. Calder the following morning. What he did next, in the weeks before Christmas, was private and deliberate. He reviewed the draft proposal he intended to make, a contractual arrangement, a position of genuine authority, a defined salary that accounted for what the role actually required, and he revised it 3 times. He increased the salary figure each time. He removed language that described the role in terms of service and replaced it with language that described it in terms of management, which was the accurate description. He found, somewhere in the 3rd revision, that he was thinking less about the structural problem and more about the particular care with which someone had annotated those contract renegotiations, the margin notes, the alternatives considered, the calculations that showed why a different term had been chosen, and he sat with that thought for longer than the situation technically required. He stood in the corridor outside the music room at Ravenswood for 3 nights that December, listening to the housekeeper he had asked to visit, a relative's household nearby, arranged through Calder, engineered so that Eleanor would have reason to be in the house, and he would have occasion to hear, incidentally, whether she played. She played his mother's composition. A short piece, a private one, nothing anyone outside the family would have recognized. And she played it as though she had found it in the room itself, rather than on paper, which meant she had not found it on paper, which meant she had heard it somewhere, or worked it out from nothing. He stood outside the closed door on the 3rd night and did not go in. He was not ready, but he was, very clearly, decided. The offer arrived in January, delivered by Mr. Calder in person, as Frederick had requested. Eleanor read it at her desk in the Ashworth housekeeper's office, which was a small room off the east corridor that smelled of dried lavender and account ledgers, and she read it twice before she put it down. It was not the position she had expected. It was not a housekeeper's role. The document described a position that did not have an existing name in any household she was familiar with. Estate administrator was the closest term, with authority over staff, contracts, accounts, and the management of Ravenswood's tenant relations. The salary was £120 annually. The term was initially 2 years, renewable. There was a clause requiring her countersignature on any estate expenditure above £50. She put the document down and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she looked at it again. Mr. Calder was watching her with the expression he always had, which was the expression of a man who had filed most of his feelings away decades ago, but occasionally had difficulty completely closing the drawer. "He is serious," Calder said. "I can see that," Eleanor said. "The salary is honest. It is more than honest." She was quiet for a moment. "He knows what the role requires. He had it investigated." She looked up at Calder. "He had me investigated." "He had the position investigated. You were the candidate who appeared relevant." Calder set his hat on the corner of her desk in the way he only did when he intended to stay longer than expected. "Eleanor, the Ashworth position is safe and known. Ravenswood requires a decision." She understood what he meant. She had understood it within the first reading of the document. Ravenswood was a larger property, a more complex problem, and a duke who had conducted his household management in a manner that would require not gentle improvement, but systematic reconstruction. It was also a position in which her authority was written into the contract in specific, non-negotiable terms, which was something she had not had at Ashworth, had never had anywhere, had only built over time through demonstrated results and the slow accumulation of trust from an employer who had never quite admitted he trusted her. She thought about it for 2 days. She reviewed the estate summary Calder had brought. She wrote 3 questions she intended to put to the Duke before signing anything, and she drafted what she considered an appropriate counterclause regarding the conditions under which either party could terminate the arrangement. Then she sent word that she would come to Ravenswood. Ravenswood was larger than she had expected, which was the first surprise. The second was that it was in better structural condition than the accounts had suggested, which told her the mismanagement was primarily systemic rather than physical. decisions poorly tracked, contracts poorly managed, staff decisions made without documentation, but the underlying property sound and the tenant relationships functional in their basics, if not in their organization. The third surprise was the Duke of Ravenswood himself. He met her in the estate office, not the drawing room, which was either a deliberate choice or the unrehearsed choice of a man who thought about things functionally rather than socially. He was taller than she had registered at the ball, and he wore a coat that had been well made some years ago, and maintained carefully since, and his cravat was crooked on the left side again, the same quarter-inch, the same pin placed too high. Eleanor noted it and said nothing. He said, "You have questions." She said, "3." He said, "Then ask them." She asked them whether the counterclause she proposed on contract termination was acceptable, whether the existing steward's records could be made available to her in full, regardless of what they contained, and whether the authority described in the document was real or nominal. He answered all 3 without hesitation and without consulting anyone. The counterclause was acceptable. The steward's records would be provided in full that afternoon. The authority was real. "I have no interest in managing the accounts," he said, "and no competence for it, and I am sufficiently aware of both to have had the proposal drafted the way it was drafted." It was the most direct statement of personal limitation Eleanor had heard from any employer in 8 years. She considered it for a moment. "Then I will sign," she said. She moved into Ravenswood in the first week of February. Her room was in the household wing, appropriate, given the role, and it was larger than her room at Ashworth, with a window that looked over the east garden. Maisie Dodd, who was the senior housemaid, and who had been at Ravenswood for 7 years, and who was, Eleanor recognized immediately, the person who actually knew where everything was, and why it was there, came to find her on the first morning, with a cup of tea, and the particular expression of a woman who has been keeping a household running, by force of personal will, in the absence of adequate direction, and who is not certain whether the newcomer represents relief or additional complication. Eleanor said, "You have been doing 3 people's work for some time. Tell me what the 3 people would be, and I will work out which of them we actually need." Maisie's expression shifted. "The linen contracts haven't been renegotiated in 4 years, she said. "Show me." They spent the first morning in the supply room, going through every current contract, with the specific focus Eleanor applied to every new household. What was agreed, what was actually delivered, and whether the margin between the two had been documented. It had not been documented. Eleanor began documenting it. By afternoon she had identified a linen supplier who was delivering at a price set in 1814 to a quality specification set in 1816. 3 years of incremental degradation that no one had noticed because no one had put the 2 documents next to each other. The Duke came to find her in the supply room at 4 o'clock. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the table, which was covered in documents arranged in a system that would have been legible to anyone who spent 5 minutes with it. "I expected you to need more time," he said. "I expected the situation to be worse," she said, which was accurate. He was quiet for a moment. "Is that encouraging? It means the problems are solvable." She did not look up from the supplier schedule she was annotating. "The linen situation will take 2 weeks to resolve. The staff records will take a month. The tenant accounts I cannot assess until I have the steward's full records, which I understood would be provided today. They are in the East Library. Then I will be in the East Library this evening." He did not say anything. He simply moved out of the doorway and, she heard a moment later, arranged for a lamp to be brought to the East Library. It was the first thing he did for her that she had not asked for and had not expected. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the supply table and then returned to her annotation. The opposition assembled itself with the particular efficiency of social systems that believe they are defending something legitimate, which in some respects they were. Lady Hargrove arrived at Ravenswood on the 4th day of Eleanor's tenure, which Eleanor considered a confident response time. Lady Hargrove was the daughter of the Earl of Whitmore, and had been, in the county's understanding, the appropriate candidate for the Duchess of Ravenswood for approximately 3 years. A conclusion based on her family's standing, her own intelligence and social accomplishment, and the frequency with which her mother had managed to place her in proximity to the Duke at public events. She was beautiful in the specific way that aristocratic women with good bone structure and careful presentation were beautiful, and she was clever enough to understand that Eleanor's presence at Ravenswood was not a domestic appointment. She was shown into the drawing room while Eleanor was in the Duke's study, reviewing the first year of the estate accounts. The Duke received her there. Eleanor could hear their voices at a distance and did not listen to the content. 20 minutes later, Lady Hargrove found her in the study doorway. She looked at the account ledgers, the annotated pages, the precise arrangement of documents that Eleanor had created in 4 days on the desk that had apparently not been used for estate work in some time, and she said, with a particular quality of calm, "You are the housekeeper." "Estate administrator," Eleanor said, without looking up from the account she was reviewing. Of course, there was a pause that had weight in it. His Grace keeps unusual arrangements. Eleanor looked up then, because it was the appropriate response to a statement made directly, and she was not in the habit of declining eye contact. "The estate required a particular kind of reorganization," she said. "I have the relevant experience." "Yes," Lady Hargrove said. "I'm certain you do." She looked at the desk once more, the specific, measuring look of a person accounting for what they are looking at, and then withdrew. Eleanor returned to the account. The figure she had been examining before the interruption was a discrepancy of £37 between a contractor's invoice and the recorded payment in the 1815 ledger. She found the corresponding bank record 15 minutes later, in the third file of the steward's documentation. The £37 had been paid to a second account she did not yet have documentation for. She noted it and moved forward. The Duke's father arrived on the 9th day. Lord Bartholomew Ashworth, the Earl, the Duke's uncle by blood and the closest male relative with standing, arrived without announcement, which Eleanor suspected was a deliberate choice, and was shown into the library where Eleanor was working on the tenant ledger reconstruction. He was a tall man in his 60s with the bearing of someone who had spent a long time being the most significant person in any room he entered, and he looked at Eleanor with the same quality of inventory-taking that Philip Crane had shown 11 years ago, which Eleanor found she could receive without flinching. "You are the woman Frederick has installed," he said. "I am the estate administrator," Eleanor said. "Lord Bartholomew. A woman in this role is irregular. The estate accounts have 3 years of unreconciled entries, and 2 supplier contracts that have been rolling on penalty terms since 1817. Irregular management produced an irregular problem. His Grace considered an irregular solution appropriate." She kept her tone level and her hands still on the ledger. "I am happy to explain the current state of the accounts, if that would be useful." Lord Bartholomew regarded her for a long moment. He was not stupid, she could see that clearly, and he was not particularly malicious. He was a man who believed that the machinery of his world was correctly calibrated, and that disruptions to it created unpredictable consequences. "This is not appropriate," he said finally. "Whatever my nephew imagines he is achieving." "What he is achieving," Eleanor said, "is a recoverable estate management situation. The specifics are in the preliminary report I will present to him on Thursday. You are welcome to attend." He left without responding. Eleanor returned to the tenant ledger. She had managed Lord Bartholomew's type before. She had managed Philip Crane. She was not going to step aside for anyone, and she was not going to lose her composure over a disapproval that was structural rather than personal. He was not wrong about the irregularity, he was wrong about what it meant. What she had not entirely prepared herself for was the Duke. He came to the East Library on the 11th evening, at 9 o'clock, carrying a glass of wine she had not asked for, and setting it on the table beside her without comment. He pulled the chair across the table without asking whether she minded. He sat. He looked at the ledger reconstruction she had spread across 3 feet of table, the original entries, her annotations, the cross-referenced supplier documents, the corrected figures in her own hand in the 4th column, and he said nothing for a long time. "The £37 discrepancy," he said finally. "I found 3 more," she said, "all paid to the same secondary account. The account corresponds to a solicitor in Bath who closed his practice in 1819. Frederick was very still. The steward, over 4 years, £112. She turned the ledger to face him. "I have the bank records from Calder. It is complete." He looked at the documentation for the time she had come to recognize as his particular form of processing, not slow, not uncertain, but thorough. Then he said, "What do you recommend?" She told him. She had the recommendation in full, the legal options, the practical considerations, the reputational implications, and her assessment of which approach recovered the most of the loss while producing the least public disruption. She presented it in the same order she had documented it, organized by impact, with the relevant documentation available for each point. When she finished, he was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, which was the expression of someone encountering evidence that confirms a hypothesis they had almost stopped believing in. "You play piano," he said. The shift was so complete that she stopped. "I do," she said after a moment. "My mother composed a piece, a short one. I have not heard it in 6 years." She understood what he was telling her, and she understood that he was aware of how much he was telling her, and she understood that this was not a man who said more than he meant. She held the information for a moment. "I heard it," she said. "In December, the music room at Kendall House, the house his cousin owned, where she had been visiting. She had found the composition on the piano bench without identification, and learned it in one sitting, because it was the kind of piece that asked to be learned." Frederick nodded once, then he reached across the table and moved her wineglass 2 inches to the right, out of proximity to the open ledger, in the precise and unasked-for way of someone who has been watching what you are doing and wants to protect it. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. They remained in the library for another hour, working in the particular companionable quiet of 2 people who have both grown accustomed to working alone and have discovered, without announcing it, that they are not working alone anymore. The formal inquiry into Ravenswood's estate management was Lord Bartholomew's idea, which Eleanor suspected he believed would resolve the matter in one direction, and which she intended to ensure resolved it in another. It was convened in the 3rd week of March, in the estate room at Ravenswood, with the 3 senior investors of the Ravenswood Land Trust, men who held financial interest in the estate's management and who had a legal right to review accounts on 60 days' notice, a clause that Lord Bartholomew had invoked with approximately 43 days' notice, which Eleanor noted was a structural shortfall but not fatal. Frederick had said, when she informed him, only, "Are you ready?" "I have been ready since the 19th of February, she said, which was the date she had completed the preliminary reconstruction. "The question is whether the documentation is complete. And is it? It will be complete by Thursday." There was one moment she had not been expecting, which was the day before the inquiry, when Charlotte Pierce, a young woman who was visiting her cousin at the neighboring estate, and who had met Eleanor at the Ravenswood tenants' dinner the previous week, and who had an immediate and direct quality that Eleanor found unexpectedly refreshing, came to find her in the estate office and said, with a frankness that was either brave or naive or both, "I have heard what Lord Bartholomew intends to argue tomorrow. I thought you should know." What Lord Bartholomew intended to argue, apparently, was that the irregularity of Eleanor's position created a structural uncertainty regarding the contractual authority she had exercised in the previous 6 weeks, which would render several of her decisions subject to review and potentially reversal. Eleanor looked at Charlotte for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "that is useful. Are you not concerned?" "I am always concerned," Eleanor said. "That is what the documentation is for." She spent that evening reviewing her counter-argument, which was already prepared, and adding 3 additional supporting documents she had been keeping in reserve. Then she put her hand flat on the completed file and sat with it for a moment, the way she had once sat with her hand on the account ledger at Ashworth, and then she put the file in order and went to bed. The inquiry convened at 10 o'clock. The estate room held the 3 investors, Mr. Pemberton, Mr. Gryce, and Sir Aldous Webb, and Lord Bartholomew, and Frederick, and Eleanor, who sat at the far end of the table with a file that was 3 inches thick, and organized with the same precision she brought to everything. Lord Bartholomew presented his argument. It was a competent argument, made by a man who knew the law sufficiently and who genuinely believed the position he was advancing. The structural irregularity of Eleanor's appointment, he contended, meant that decisions made under her authority, including the supplier contract revisions and the tenant account corrections she had initiated, were vulnerable. The estate would be better served, he argued, by a return to conventional management arrangements, meaning a male steward of appropriate standing, and a review of the changes made in the past 6 weeks. When he finished, Mr. Pemberton, who was 61 and had reviewed accounts for longer than most people in the room had been alive, looked at the file in front of Eleanor and said, "I take it you have something to present." "I do," Eleanor said. She presented for 40 minutes. She did not argue Lord Bartholomew's legal position, she did not have the legal training to contest it, and she did not need to. What she did was document, with precision, what the estate had looked like on the 1st of February and what it looked like now. She used the original accounts and her corrections side by side. She presented the supplier contracts, the original terms, the terms she had renegotiated, and the projected annual saving across 3 years, which was £437. She presented the tenant account reconstruction, which had identified 2 outstanding payments totaling £60 that had not been recorded. She presented the steward's embezzlement documentation, organized, dated, reference to the bank records, totaling £112 across 4 years. She presented the linen supplier contract, the kitchen supply revision, the timber arrangement she had identified as penalty exposed and renegotiated in the 2nd week of March. She presented the staffing adjustment she had recommended to the Duke, 3 roles restructured, 1 role consolidated, net saving of £65 annually, with no reduction in function. She set each document down as she discussed it, building a physical structure on the table that was the visible record of 6 weeks of work she had done before breakfast and after dinner, and in the East Library at 9 o'clock at night. 29 of the 37 outstanding account discrepancies have been resolved, she said. The remaining 8 require a legal determination that is currently underway. I have the preliminary solicitor's assessment here. She placed it on the table. The estate is not only recoverable, it is, as of the 3rd week of March, showing a projected first-year improvement in operating margin of £612 against the 1819 benchmark. The room did not erupt immediately. There was a suspended moment in which the investors looked at the documents in front of them, and Lord Bartholomew looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has just found that the argument he brought to the field is less than the one he encountered there. Mr. Pemberton looked at the recovery figures for a full 30 seconds. Then he said, "I have not seen an estate account reconstruction of this quality in 20 years of investment review." Sir Aldous Webb said, "Who prepared these?" "I prepared them," Eleanor said. There was a second pause. Then Frederick Ashworth stood up. She had not expected him to stand. The inquiry was procedural, and she had the documentation, and the case was made, and she had not needed him to do anything beyond attend. She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who is recalibrating rapidly. He said, "I would like to address Lord Bartholomew's structural objection directly." He was not looking at Lord Bartholomew. He was looking at the investors, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has decided something and is communicating the decision rather than negotiating it. Miss Eleanor Crane's appointment is irregular by convention. It is not irregular by law. The contract was drawn by Mr. Edward Calder, who is present in the outer hall and available for consultation. Every decision made under her authority was countersigned by me. Her authority is absolute within the terms of the contract, and I have no intention of revising it. He paused. Then he crossed to Eleanor's end of the table, and he picked up the recovery projection, the single-page summary she had placed last, the document that showed the £612 margin improvement, and he set it in front of Mr. Pemberton with a deliberateness that required no further explanation. "The estate," he said, "is well managed. I recommend the inquiry close." Mr. Pemberton reviewed the summary. Mr. Gryce reviewed the supplier contracts. Sir Aldous Webb reviewed the tenant accounts. The inquiry closed. Lord Bartholomew remained seated after the investors had gone. Eleanor gathered her documents with the same systematic care she had used to present them, because the documents needed to be filed in the order they had been used, and that was simply correct practice. She was aware of Lord Bartholomew's presence at the other end of the table, and she did not hurry. When she looked up, he was watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before, which was not warmth and not apology, but was a form of reappraisal, the particular expression of a man looking at something he had dismissed and finding that his dismissal was not as thorough as he had believed. He said, "That linen contract, 4 years of degraded specification." 4 years and 3 months, Eleanor said. "Who notices that?" "I do," she said simply. He was quiet for a long moment, then he stood, and he picked up his hat, and he said, "The estate management decisions my nephew has made in the past 6 weeks show better judgment than I would have predicted." It was not an apology. It was, in its careful and limited way, an acknowledgement. He left without further remark. Eleanor stood in the estate room for a moment after he was gone. She placed one hand briefly against the table, feeling the solid grain of it. Then she picked up her file and went to find Frederick. He was in the East Garden, which was where he went when he needed to think, which Eleanor had learned in 6 weeks of proximity, the way she learned everything, by observation rather than inquiry. He was standing at the wall that bordered the kitchen garden, and he turned when he heard her on the path, and his expression had the quality she had come to think of as his genuine register, not the composed public face, but the face he had when he was not performing anything. He said, "You were complete. I had a complete file," she said. "That is not what I mean." She stopped on the path. The light was late and cold, and the garden smelled of turned earth and something flowering very early, and she understood what he meant, and she held it without flinching. He said, "I stood outside the music room in December for 3 nights." She had suspected this, and finding that the suspicion was accurate was different from suspecting it. It had weight, it had specificity, it had the particularity of a thing that had actually happened. "I know," she said. "You knew in December. I knew someone was there. I did not know it was you until March," she considered, "when you moved the wine glass." Frederick looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it correctly, and I want you to know that I have thought about it since January, and not from obligation." "Then ask it," she said. "Not today," he said. "Today was the inquiry and the documentation, and 6 weeks of work I watched you do from a distance. I kept deliberately, because I did not want to complicate your authority. Tomorrow, if you are willing." She considered this for a moment, which was the appropriate response to a statement made with that quality of care. "Tomorrow," she said. She had managed 37 account discrepancies and 4 years of a linen contract. She could manage one evening. He came to find her in the East Library in the morning, when the light was coming in from the garden, and the account ledgers were already open because she had been there since 7 o'clock. He did not sit down. He stood at the edge of the table and he said, "I would like you to consider a different arrangement." Eleanor set her pen down. "Not because the contract requires revision," he said, "not because the inquiry produced a specific outcome, or because Lord Bartholomew needs a structural answer, or because the investors require a demonstration. Because I have spent 6 weeks watching you work, and I know what I am watching, and I know what I have not had before, and I am not going to allow the situation to remain unclear, because I am uncertain how to proceed." He paused. "I am not uncertain. I am choosing my words carefully." He looked at her across the table with the expression she now recognized as his truest one, and he said, "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the most capable and honest person I have been in a room with in 6 years. And because you play my mother's composition as though you found it yourself, and because you knew my cravat was crooked at the Ashworth ball in December, and did not say so until you were comfortable enough to say so, and I find I would like you to be comfortable in that way for the rest of my life." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ledger in front of her, the completed reconstruction, the organized file, the 6 weeks of work that was now the foundation of a functional estate, and then she looked at him. "Your cravat," she said, "is crooked again." He looked down. It was, in fact, crooked, the same pin, the same 1/4 inch. He had dressed himself this morning without a valet, which was something he did when he was thinking about something else. Eleanor came around the table and straightened it, which required precisely 8 seconds and her bare fingers on the linen, which was the most deliberate physical action she had taken in 6 weeks of careful professional distance. She stepped back and looked at the result. "Yes," she said, "I will consider the different arrangement." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is not a direct answer." "I know," she said. "I will give you one this afternoon. I think about things completely before answering." He almost smiled. "I know," he said. "I have been watching." She thought about it completely. She thought about it the way she had thought about the Ravenswood position in January, reviewing what was real, what was offered, what it required, and what it was worth. She thought about what it meant to be seen after 11 years of invisibility, and what it meant that the person who saw her had stood outside a music room for 3 nights, rather than opening the door, which was the most careful and considered form of attention she had ever been given. She thought about the East Library, and the wine glass moved 2 inches, and the lamp arranged without being asked for. She thought about the inquiry, and the way he had stood up. She went to find him at 4 o'clock. He was in the estate office reviewing the solicitor's preliminary report on the embezzlement documentation, which was exactly where she had expected him to be. She said, "Yes." He looked up from the report. "The arrangement," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, and then he stood up, and he extended his hand across the desk, the same gesture, the same economy, the same deliberateness with which he did everything, and she took it, and it was the simplest and most complete transaction of her adult life. They were married in April, in the church in the village nearest Ravenswood, in a service that was small and exact, attended by Mr. Calder and Charlotte Pierce and Maisie Dodd, who wept with a lack of embarrassment that Eleanor found more moving than she had anticipated. Lord Bartholomew attended, which was not something Eleanor had expected. He sat in the 3rd row and did not speak to her before the ceremony, but at the conclusion, when the register had been signed, and the rector had said his final words, and the cold April light was coming through the windows in long flat columns, he met her eye across the aisle, and gave her a nod that was small and precise and genuine. It was enough. She did not need more than that. The life they built at Ravenswood was not the life she had managed at Ashworth, not the life of invisible labor and unremarked precision. It was not, either, the life the county had expected for a duke's household, which was the life of elaborate ceremony and social performance, and decisions made by people who held titles, and trusted that the holding of titles was sufficient qualification for making them. It was a working life, and a careful one, and a life in which 2 people who had each, in their separate ways, been alone for a very long time, had found in each other the specific company they had not known they were missing. Eleanor completed the estate account reconstruction by June. The £612 first-year margin improvement was confirmed by Mr. Pemberton's review in July. The following spring, at the request of 2 neighboring estate managers who had heard about the Ravenswood account system through the network of solicitors who handled land trust reviews, she prepared a documentation framework that could be applied to comparable estates, a practical manual, organized precisely, annotated with the reasoning behind each element. Mr. Calder arranged for it to be distributed through his practice to 5 clients in the first year. By the end of the second year, 12 estates in 3 counties were using it. Frederick had the first edition bound in the Ravenswood Library, in a green cover that matched the account ledgers. He placed it on the shelf between his mother's composition book and a volume of estate law that Eleanor had annotated so thoroughly over the first year that the annotations were nearly as long as the original text. Their daughter, Margaret, arrived in the 2nd year of their marriage. She had Frederick's particular quality of focused attention and Eleanor's habit of noticing what was slightly wrong in a room, which combination Eleanor found alternately delightful and occasionally exhausting. Margaret walked at 10 months, spoke clearly at 14 months, and by the age of 3 could reach the lowest shelf of the estate office bookcase, from which she removed the ledgers one at a time with a methodical thoroughness that suggested she had inherited her mother's organizational instinct alongside her father's persistence. One evening in Margaret's 3rd year, when the child had escaped her crib for the 2nd time and been retrieved from the corridor where she was attempting to reach the door to the estate office, Eleanor was sitting at the desk in the East Library, reviewing the tenant accounts for the quarterly report. Frederick came in from the corridor with Margaret on his arm. A small person in a white nightgown who was perfectly awake and entirely unrepentant about it. He set her down at the edge of the table, and she immediately attempted to climb toward the nearest ledger. Eleanor took the ledger out of range. Margaret looked at her with Frederick's expression, the measuring attention that had first found Eleanor at the edge of a ballroom in December, now present in a 3-year-old's face in the lamplight of the East Library. Frederick sat down in the chair across the table, the one he had pulled up on the 11th evening of Eleanor's arrival without asking whether she minded, and he watched his wife and his daughter negotiate the question of the ledger, and his expression had the quality Eleanor had come to know as his truest form of contentment, not displayed, not performed, but simply present, in the way that real things are present, with no requirement to be anything other than what they are. Eleanor looked up from the ledger. She looked at him looking at her. She understood what she was seeing, and she held it without sentiment, with the same precision she brought to everything, and she found that it was enough, more than enough. It was the full account, balanced and without discrepancy, built on work and recognition, and the particular kind of love that looks like a lamp arranged in the East Library, and a wine glass moved 2 inches, and a man standing in a corridor for 3 nights rather than opening the door. The lamplight held them all. Margaret, exhausted at last, put her head down on the table between the ledgers and fell asleep. Eleanor covered her with Frederick's coat. He had draped it over the chair back when he came in, and it was warm, and it was there,